They laughed so hard they cried. Old Tom set his whiskey down and held his ribs like they might split. Two of the Peterman boys nearly fell into the snow from how hard they were cackling. And Sheriff Clay, standing with arms folded just outside the trading post, didn't laugh, but he smirked like the rest of them. Because right there, rising like some oversized joke out of the bare white ground, was a half-finished wigwam. Not a teepee, not a log cabin. A wigwam, made of woven saplings, mud, reeds, and hides. And inside it, hammering at wooden joists like she hadn't heard a single insult, was a widow. Her name was Clara Goss, and they called her crazy. They said she had no man to help, no sons, no real wood, just a baby on the way and a fire in her gut. They said building anything that round was foolish. They said a proper home had walls that stood straight, corners that squared, and a roof that sloped down to carry off snow like water off a duck's back. But Clara didn't care. She bent the saplings herself, heated them in boiling water and curled them like ribs. She dug the trench around the base herself. She bartered for hides, woven mats, and old oilskin tarps to layer like scales along the dome. And while the men of Penance Valley drank and jeered and called it the belly hut, she built and built, because Clara Goss hadn't come west to play house. She'd come west to survive. The trail to Penance Valley was cruel, a winding gorge flanked by wind-polished granite and shadowed ravines. Clara had come down it with a broken wagon, 3 dead horses, and her belly heavy with child. Her husband, Josiah, had frozen 3 nights before reaching the town. She buried him by a boulder marked with soot. The townsfolk gave her a cot in the church hall and a sack of flour. She lasted 1 week there. Then she walked into the wild, picked a small rise east of the creek, and started hammering stakes into the frozen earth. "Wigwams are for Injuns," barked Mr. Flint, the sawmill man. "Not white women." But Clara had once lived with the Nipmuc during her childhood, when her missionary parents had gone north into old Massachusetts. She'd seen how round walls held heat, how smoke funneled out the top, not sideways, how earth-packed floors never let the wind creep up. She'd seen winter break the proudest cabins, yet leave the old domes standing like stones in a storm. Now she was building her own. Her hands bled, her cheeks cracked, her breath puffed through split lips like steam from a kettle. She worked until she staggered. She wrapped her stomach tight with cloth and sat only when her back gave out. There were times she swayed like a drunkard, but she never fell. Each night she slept beside a fire pit dug into the ground. Each morning she woke colder than the last. But the dome rose. The willow ribs crossed in a perfect curve. The mats thickened in layers. Snow piled on top and stuck because the shape shed the worst winds, not caught them like cabin walls did. She sealed gaps with mud, moss, and strips of rabbit hide. Inside it smelled like earth and pine sap and smoke, and it held. Sheriff Clay rode past it in mid-November and said nothing, just spit and shook his head. When it snowed, the townsfolk pointed from the porch of Miss Adelie's cafe and made jokes. She building a womb to give birth in? Hope she likes soup, 'cause no chimney means smoked stew for dinner. Bet she thinks she's a squaw now. Snow'll crush that dome like an egg. But none of them helped, and none of them came close. Only one did, little Addie Flint, daughter of the sawmill man. She came one morning in early December with a wool scarf and a tin of dried beans. She said nothing, just left them by the door flap and ran. Clara saw her and smiled. She cried later, holding that tin like it was gold. The dome finished just before the storm. It came with a low wind that howled up the valley like a scream. The snow came next, sharp as needles, thick as feathers, endless. The Peterman boys' cabin lost a corner. The roof of the preacher's shed buckled in. One of the outlying shacks buried so fast the couple inside nearly died before their neighbors dug them out. But Clara's dome? It disappeared in snow, but held. Inside, she had built a ring of stones for a fire pit, dug below the frozen line. She lined the floor with bark and straw and old rags. She stacked wood in a dry notch behind the fire, and she gave birth in that round shelter with no midwife, no fire but coals, no food but those beans, and a few strips of dried meat. And her baby lived, a boy. She named him Josiah II. The storm lasted 4 days. When it passed, the town was silent. Chimneys had collapsed. Roofs groaned under ice. 3 families had taken refuge in the saloon, one in the church, another under the collapsed beams of their own kitchen. Half the town's cabins had gaping holes, snowdrifts in their corners, shattered window panes. But when Tom and Sheriff Clay finally stomped through the white fields to check on the belly hut, they found it covered in snow so thick it looked like a hillock. Clay knocked once. The flap opened. Warm air spilled out, and there, in the dim orange glow of a fire still burning, sat Clara, child at her breast, cheeks flushed with heat, a look in her eyes like stone. They didn't say a word, not a joke, not a grin, because Clara Goss widow of the valley, had outlived them all, and winter had just begun. The silence lingered long after Sheriff Clay and Tom trudged away from the wigwam, their boots crunching into the snow like hesitant apologies. They didn't look back, and Clara didn't watch them go. She leaned back against the curved wall of her shelter, her infant bundled in tattered linens against her chest, heart thudding like a war drum in her ears. Outside, the snow was 3 feet deep. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the round walls glowed gold. She had done it. She had survived the storm that wrecked cabins, crushed roofs, drove strong men to weep behind shut doors, and not only survived, but birthed life into it. The boy, Josiah, had come screaming into the world on the second night of the blizzard. No help, no midwife, just Clara biting on leather, screaming louder than the wind, until her voice cracked and her strength gave way to the cries of her newborn son. She had kept him warm with her body and strips of rabbit hide. She fed him from her own aching body. The storm had threatened to take her, and she'd stood taller than it, bent, bleeding but not broken. And now the town couldn't laugh, not anymore. But what they wouldn't do, even now, was help. She watched the days pass in that silence. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys, then stopped. Men came out only to shovel, heads bowed, faces lined in blue. The saloon stayed open, but light barely leaked from the frosted windows. She heard hammering from the direction of the preacher's house. Miss Adeli's cafe never reopened. No one came to check on her again, not even little Addie. Clara didn't blame them. She'd built her shelter away from their clapboard cluster. Her dome stood near the tree line, apart, strange, tribal in their eyes. They called her the Earth Woman now, muttered it low when they passed, as though saying it out loud gave her some power they didn't want to feed. They feared her, now that the snow had bowed to her shape and her boy had cried through a storm that killed stronger children in square houses. But she had no use for fear. She needed wood, and she needed food. She wrapped Josiah against her chest and stepped into the cold. Her boots were cracked, her mittens worn thin. The snow reached her knees. The birches around her snapped with frost. She found one that had fallen, half rotted, and broke it apart with a hatchet dulled by use. It took her an hour to drag it back through the snow, her body trembling with each step, her breath curling like steam. She cut the branches in half, then quartered them over stone. That night the dome grew warmer. That night Josiah didn't cry, but her stores were nearly gone. She had 3 strips of smoked rabbit, a tin of beans, a flour sack nearly empty. The baby fed from her, but she needed food for herself, and the storm had emptied the forest of most life. The creeks were frozen, the brush was buried, and the valley held its breath for what came next. On the 7th morning after the storm, Clara went to the trading post. Heads turned, eyes dropped. She stepped through the warped door with her head high, holding Josiah close, and walked up to the counter where Mr. Donnelly stood, beard iced, hands shaking over a ledger. "Need flour," she said. He didn't look her in the eye. $2 a pound. She blinked. "That's robbery." He shrugged. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the last of her coins. $7, mixed in silver and old greenbacks. She slapped them on the counter. "Flour, dried meat, salt. That's what I've got." Donnelly looked over her shoulder. A few men lingered by the stove at the back, Tom among them. No one moved. "Take it," he muttered finally. She did. She didn't thank him. Outside, she nearly slipped on the ice-slick stoop. The moment her boots hit snow, someone called from behind. "Clara!" She turned. It was Sheriff Clay. His badge hung crooked on his sheepskin coat, and he looked older than before, his cheeks thinner, his eyes darker. "You can't stay out there all winter," he said. "That dome, it ain't right." She waited. "You and the boy, you come stay at the church house. I can make it happen." Clara narrowed her eyes. "Now that the storm's passed?" she asked. He shifted his weight. "It ain't safe. Another blizzard. Like that?" "It held," she said simply. Clay swallowed. "Won't hold forever." She stepped closer. "Neither will any of yours." And then she turned and walked. More snow came. It fell gentle at first, then angry. Wind lashed down the valley and pounded the ridgelines. But Clara was ready this time. She'd added a layer of canvas over the dome, tightened the flap, dug out the entrance to slope down and trap heat. She melted snow for water and rationed the flour. She only left twice, once for wood, once to bury a frozen fox she found outside, its ribs showing through grey fur. No one came to check on her. But in that silence, Josiah grew. His cries grew stronger. His cheeks flushed pink. He smiled. Clara whispered stories to him beneath the low ceiling, holding him tight as the fire hissed. She sang lullabies her mother had once hummed, songs from forgotten churches and forest camps. She braided reeds into cords to patch the wall seams and hung meat to dry. when she managed to snare a rabbit. She remembered her old life only in fragments now. Boston, her father's books, the piano she'd learned on, the way Josiah's hand had held hers when they'd signed their names to the land grant. All of it faded behind the curve of her dome, the hum of snow above, and the child at her chest. She no longer dreamed of rescue, she was the rescue. The town, meanwhile, was suffering. Sheriff Clay came to her again, 2 weeks later. This time he didn't come with words. He came with a child, Addie Flint. Her face was pale, her hands frostbitten, her breath shallow. Clay carried her like she was made of glass. She wandered off, he said, looking for rabbits. Her pa's got the fever. We found her this morning. Clara stepped aside without a word. She fed Addie warm broth made from salted meat and roots. She wrapped her hands in cloth soaked in vinegar. She lay her beside Josiah, who stared wide-eyed at the strange new face. The girl coughed blood once, then slept for nearly 12 hours. When she woke, she whispered, "It's warm in here," like a mouth. Clara smiled. "That's how it's meant to be." Sheriff Clay stayed the night. He didn't speak again. He watched the fire like it was the last real thing left in the world. Word spread. 2 days later, the preacher's wife came, baby in arms, face blistered, husband too weak to speak. Clara let her in. Then came one of the Peterman boys, face burned from chimney smoke, coughing so hard he near collapsed. Then a pregnant girl from the saloon. Then Miss Adelie herself, dragging a sled with 2 barrels of salted pork and barely a coat to shield her. By the 3rd night, the dome was full. The fire burned bright. The smoke curled perfectly out the top vent. The walls didn't sweat. The warmth didn't leave. People lay along the curved interior like they were curled in the ribcage of some great beast that had taken them all in from the storm. Clara rationed everything. She cooked stew in a single pot. She held crying children and snapped at men who wouldn't stoke the fire right. And slowly, very slowly, the town stopped mocking. They started asking, "Could I build one like this? How do the poles bend? What did you seal it with? Why is it warmer than my whole house ever was?" Clara told them. Not kindly, not coldly, just the facts. She drew circles in the dirt and showed where the trench went, how to set the ribs, how to thatch the top. She taught Addie how to weave bark cord. She made the preacher's wife patch torn canvas, and the town watched, some in shame, some in awe. A month later, Clara stepped outside and saw a dome rising beside the preacher's ruined house, then another near the sawmill, then a third by the schoolhouse where one of the teacher's aides had begun bending saplings in a tight circle. By March, the town of Penance Valley had 5 wigwams, and only Clara's still glowed every night, full of people, because only hers was a home. By the time the second thaw arrived, Penance Valley looked less like a frontier town and more like a half-forgotten encampment of rounded hills stitched with hide, canvas, and straw. Wigwams peppered the snowfields where square cabins had once stood proud. Half-finished domes rose beside blackened ruins, and even the preacher, who once declared Clara's shelter a pagan womb, now lived in one with his ailing wife and 3 children. His voice lowered, his sermons shorter, his pride crumbling like the cabins he used to bless. But the one that stood strongest, warmest, fullest, that was still Clara's. Clara, who hadn't just endured the storms, she had changed the town, but she didn't see it that way. Not yet. She rose each day before the rest, stoking the fire with what little dry wood they still had, melting snow in an iron kettle, feeding Josiah from her breast, then wrapping herself in a patched wool coat and stepping into the cold to find more fuel. Her body ached. Her bones felt years older than the winter had earned, but she moved like something powered by deeper gears, by the quiet determination of someone who had known true abandonment and refused to bow to it again. She didn't think of herself as a leader or a savior. She was just a widow with a child, surviving the cold the only way she knew how. The dome, once silent and solitary, now pulsed with voices. Addie Flint had made a nest of blankets in the corner and called it hers. She followed Clara like a shadow, asking about everything: why the fire vent worked, how to tan rabbit hides, why the floor was warmer when they laid pine boughs beneath it. "You're a witch," she whispered once, grinning. Clara looked up from the stew pot, raising an eyebrow. "I mean it in the good way," Addie said, "like a smart witch, like in the stories. But real," Clara snorted, "real witches die in winters. Like these, they just do it with fancier words." Addie laughed, but Clara's voice had held no humor. On the second week of March, the town's first birth since the storm happened, not in a church, not in a cabin, but in Clara's dome. It was Miss Adderley, the cafe owner, who'd kept her pregnancy quiet after losing her first child the previous year. She labored all day and into the night. Clara held her hand. Addie sang lullabies in the background. Sheriff Clay stood outside in the snow, arms folded, not pacing, but never leaving. Inside, every soul fell quiet as the first cry echoed off the low walls, soft, unsure, then stronger. A girl. Adele sobbed when she held her, rocking her like she was made of spun glass. She named her Mira, meaning miracle, though Clara never asked in which language. That night no one mocked the round walls, no one. That night every voice that spoke did so in reverence. But peace never lasted long in Penance Valley, even softened by Clara's dome and the warmth it lent. Spring brought reminders of what winter had broken. The sawmill's roof had collapsed entirely, the trading post's foundation had buckled, and the store had to shut. Food was running low across the valley. The wild game had not yet returned. What little was left from the fall's hunting season had long since spoiled or been burned for warmth. The real reckoning hadn't been the blizzard. It was the hunger now. It came slow, not as a scream, but as a silence, as fewer footsteps around town, as more children crying late into the night, as men staring into empty pots, as women pressing hands against swollen bellies and counting what was left. Clara watched them come, first in ones, then twos. Quiet knocks on the hide flap, downcast eyes, mumbled apologies. She never turned them away, but she didn't have magic. She couldn't make flour from dirt, couldn't birth stew from smoke. She rationed, cut smaller portions, boiled bones longer, scraped every skin of fat and every rind of bark that could soften in broth. But it wasn't enough. And then one night, Sheriff Clay came back, this time not alone. Behind him were 6 men, hard men, the kind that stood too straight when scared and didn't speak unless they had to. They stood at the edge of her clearing, under the twisted pine, staring at the dome like it might blink. "Clara," Clay said, "we need what's inside." She stepped out into the snow, Josiah tucked under one arm, a wood-handled hatchet dangling in the other. Her face was calm, but her breath came hard. Addie stood behind her, fists clenched, eyes wide. "You have families," Clay said. "Children? I got no right to ask, but we're starving. There's meat in there, salt, flour, more than the rest of us." "Because I planned," Clara said. "I know," he said, "but planning doesn't feed a dying man." She stared at him, at all of them, then turned her back and walked inside. Moment later the flap lifted again. Clara emerged with a bundle in each hand, wrapped in canvas and tied with bark string. "Here," she said. She handed one to Clay, one to a thin man whose face she didn't know. "Enough for your children and your wives. If you have none, move aside." No one argued. No one said thank you. They just took it and vanished into the dark. Inside, she sat by the fire, Josiah now asleep, Addie silent beside her. "You should have kept it," Addie whispered. "They would have taken it anyway," Clara said. "They would have had to fight you." Clara looked at her. Her voice was quiet. "Then I'd be dead, and your corner would be cold." Addie didn't argue after that. But not all kindness was one way. 2 days later, the preacher's son came back with 3 hares tied to his belt, said nothing, just left them at her door. The next morning, Miss Adele returned with dried herbs she'd found along the creek. Sheriff Clay brought a deer's leg 3 days after that, barely any meat left on it. But what was there? He carved and handed her without a word. Then old Tom arrived. He hadn't spoken to her since the first storm, had been among the loudest to mock her. He took off his hat, held it to his chest, and said, "I got a line of traps out past the ridge. Ain't been there since before the storm. Could be something." Clara said nothing, but the next morning she followed him. They walked through knee-deep snow to the ridge. The wind howled sharp. The world smelled like ice and pine. It took hours, but the traps were there. 2 were sprung. One held a fox, starved near to death. One had a rabbit, still warm. Tom handed it to her. He said, "I was wrong." She looked at him. "You didn't come out here to prove anything," he said. "You came out here 'cause you knew no one else would carry you, and now you're carrying the rest of us." She said nothing. He added, "I don't want to die without paying that back." They walked back in silence. 2 days later, Tom brought her more hides. The town watched. Spring did come, slow, reluctant. Snow retreated from the ridgelines. Creeks trickled again. The sky softened. The dome remained. So did Clara. So did Josiah. He was crawling now, reaching for the fire with curious hands. Addie made him toys from braided reeds. Miss Adele took to brushing his hair. The preacher's wife began teaching him hymns. And Clara, she began to breathe again. Not just exist, but truly breathe. She stood one morning outside her dome, hands on her hips, and watched the first green sprigs break the soil near the snowmelt. She looked toward the town. 5 domes, 2 new ones being built, cabins under repair, voices echoing again. Not laughter yet, but not scorn either. She turned back toward her own shelter, and Josiah was there at the flap, tugging it open, wobbling upright, his little mouth forming half sounds, his eyes bright as flint, and she smiled. The thaw did not come all at once. It crept, the way hunger had crept through the valley, the way Clara's dome had risen one bent rib at a time, the way shame had come to the men who once laughed. Each morning the snow retreated a little more from the dome's base. Mud appeared in patches, then grass, yellowed and stiff, poked through the softened ground. The dome sweated in the afternoons now, not from smoke but from the sudden warmth of sun on its layered skin of hide, mat and bark. The wind still howled at night, but it wasn't sharp anymore, just lonely, just lingering. Clara stepped barefoot outside one morning, holding Josiah high on her hip. The snow had melted into slush beneath their feet. Josiah squealed, toes curling as he kicked. He was near 5 months now, thick in the cheek, heavy in the thighs, curious in the eyes. His first tooth had come with the first crocus, sharp and mean. Addie had laughed herself hoarse when Clara yelped from a surprise bite while feeding him. Josiah was strong. He was a storm child, born in blizzard, raised in fire. He did not shiver when the cold came through cracks in the door flap. He did not cry at thunder. He did not fear the dark. He was his mother's son. By mid-April, the dome emptied. The preacher's family had rebuilt half their house and moved back. Miss Adeli reopened her cafe in a smaller shack she built near the old one. Sheriff Clay patched the town jail and started sleeping in his office again. Only Addie stayed. She refused to leave Clara's dome. Even when her father called her back with tears in his voice, even when he offered a new dress and a warm bed, Addie refused. "She's my real mother now," she'd said bluntly. Clara didn't try to correct her. She didn't have the words for it, and more importantly, she didn't have the heart to deny her. She'd grown used to the girl's laughter, her questions, the way she'd perch by the fire with Josiah in her lap like a guardian owl. Clara had learned to braid her hair, to discipline her with a look, to listen when she was scared and never say nonsense the way her father had always done. Addie had made herself a place, not as a guest, but as family. The dome became something else that spring, not a refuge, a school, a blueprint. People came in the mornings to ask how to lay out stones for the hearth, how many layers to weave before mud, what kind of saplings curved best, what wood snapped under pressure, which reeds resisted mold, which bark best sealed rain. Clara drew diagrams in the dirt. She showed them the patched places where her first mistakes had nearly cost her. She passed around her knives, showed how to notch the ribs so they didn't splinter under tension. She told them, again and again, "It's not about pretty, it's about holding." Men nodded, women took notes. Children mimicked her, bending sticks and building half circles in the soil, and slowly the town changed. Not just in shape, but in rhythm. They no longer waited for supply wagons from the east. They built root cellars the way Clara had shown them, deep, dry, ringed with stones. They stacked firewood not against house walls, but inside lean-tos sunk below the snow line. They began planting early, root vegetables first, in the loose soil near the creek that Clara had said would warm soonest. They began trading food again, not just hoarding it. And when illness came, because it always came, they stopped sending for doctors who never arrived. They sent for Clara, not because she was a healer, but because they believed now that what she did worked. But not everyone welcomed the change. Some held tight to the old ways. Caleb Rankin, a rancher with 3 cabins to his name and 5 sons under his belt, stood at the center of town one afternoon and declared the wigwams an insult. "Ain't Christian," he barked, "ain't proper. Ain't what a man does with land. You build like that, you're saying you want to crawl into the dirt like an animal, not stand upright like God made us." He said it loud, and with the sheriff gone north to fetch supplies, no one stood to hush him, except Clara. She stepped through the crowd wearing her same patched coat, her boy on her hip, and Addie by her side like a knife hidden in linen. She didn't shout, she didn't accuse. She said calmly, "My dome outlived your barn, your north cabin, and your pride." Caleb turned red. "You calling me weak? I'm calling you cold. In February anyway. You remember that?" The crowd rippled. Caleb's wife, thin and sunburned, stepped forward. "Clara," she said, "would you come show us how you sealed the smoke vent? Ours keeps backdrafting." Clara nodded. Caleb didn't speak again. That night, Clara sat outside her dome as Josiah slept beside Addie, and the fire inside burned low. The air was still, not Warm, not yet, but not biting. Stars above, earth beneath. Her back ached, her hands were calloused, but her heart beat steady. Sheriff Clay returned at dusk with 4 wagons and 2 strangers from the east. He walked up the path to her dome, his breath puffing in the cool, and sat beside her on the stump she'd carved. He didn't speak for a while, then simply, "They're sending someone from the governor's office." She looked at him. "Why?" Word spread about what you built, about the town changing. "They're calling it the Wigwam miracle." She laughed, a bitter sound. "That what they're calling it, from their chairs in Austin?" He shrugged. "I didn't name it, just repeating it." She didn't speak. He went on. "They want to send someone to write it down, maybe offer you a grant, some funding. Hell, maybe even get this place on a map." She looked at him hard. "It's already on a map. I mean," she held up a hand. "Don't." They sat in silence again. Then he said, "The storm changed us." She looked back at the dome, at the smoke twisting into the stars. "No," she said, "we changed, because it didn't kill us." That spring, more domes rose, not all built by Clara's hand, but all shaped by her influence. Some mixed in square cabins, walls rebuilt, but topped with rounded roofs. Some were half sunken, like burrows. One man even built his out of stone and lime, trying to mimic the roundness, but fearing hide and sapling. And still, every night the first fire lit in Penance Valley burned in Clara's dome. The preacher rewrote his sermons. Miss Adele changed her menu to stew, and flatbread cooked the way Clara had once shown her. Children in the valley now played not house but dome. They used hoops and rags and tried to teach the smaller ones to curl like ribs. The town forgot to laugh, because laughter had turned to listening. But nature is not so easily appeased. In May, the thaw brought rain, and with rain, the river swelled. Clara had seen it once before, in Massachusetts, as a child. She knew the signs, the way the earth sagged, soaked around the creek banks, the way frogs vanished, the way certain birds took flight days early. She warned them, told them to dig trenches, to build mounds around the domes, to keep children indoors. Some listened, many didn't, until the flood came. It wasn't a wave, it wasn't thunder, it was worse. It was a slow, rising crawl, a creeping death that bled into the valley and filled root cellars first, then fire pits, then homes. Cabins cracked, chimneys fell, smoke turned to steam. It came in the middle of the night. Addie shook Clara awake. "Water's inside," she said, voice trembling. Clara sprang up, grabbed Josiah, threw a corded pack over her shoulder. She waded through ankle-high cold to the fire pit and began digging at the stones, lifting the kettle, lifting the meat, lifting anything not yet soaked. She barked orders at Addie, shoved cloth into the door flap, sealed the vent up top. Then she stepped outside. The town was screaming, but her dome stood. The curved walls held the water back, funneling it down instead of in. The sealed trench around it kept the worst at bay. Inside, the earth stayed higher than the valley floor. The fire burned still. Sheriff Clay was out in the current, yelling for people to climb. Children screamed. One woman floated past on a plank, face gray with shock, and Clara did not hesitate. She opened her arms. One by one, they came again. By dawn, the flood had soaked nearly every corner of Penance Valley, except one. The wigwam stood like a dark stone among waves, its round back turned against the current, the entrance sealed tight with hide and bark and prayer. The water licked at its base, but never entered. Where square cabins drowned and floorboards turned to rafts, Clara's dome held. The curve pushed the water aside. The trench had channeled it around. Her dome rose above the chaos like a mother animal's body, curled not in defeat, but in defense. Inside, it was not quiet. 23 souls crammed inside, soaked and shivering, huddled by the fire. Josiah slept in Addie's arms. A baby cried in the corner. Someone vomited. A man's teeth chattered like dice in a cup. The preacher muttered low prayers that no one corrected, and Clara moved through it all, barefoot, sleeves rolled, hair stuck to her face. She kept the fire high, fed it with the last of the dry wood, dried boots near the vent, boiled water, used her old canvas coat as a floor mat to keep the children off the damp earth, spoke only when needed, but every word found its mark. "No, not that log. It'll smoke. Wrap her fingers, vinegar's in the pouch. Put the baby on skin, let her breathe warmth. Hold tight, it's not over yet." All through that long, wet dawn, they clung to the heat and the sound of her voice. When the wind rose outside, they pressed closer. When something thudded against the outer wall, maybe a log, maybe a corpse, they held their breath. But the dome never shuddered. When Sheriff Clay banged on the flap in the early hours, soaked to his chest, carrying a boy half-conscious and blue, Clara pulled him in with a growl and wrapped the boy in 3 layers of hide before the flap had even shut. "Where's the rest?" she asked. "Gone," Clay said. East Ridge collapsed. 2 cabins floated downriver. His voice cracked. Clara didn't flinch. She reached for a kettle. "Then get dry, or you'll join them," he obeyed. It rained for 2 more days. They stayed in the dome the whole time, venting smoke out in short bursts, opening the flap only when necessary. They shared food, told stories, sang lullabies that faded mid-song. At night the dome smelled of wet hide, fire soot, sweat, tears, and infant milk, but no one complained, because it was warm and dry and still standing. On the 3rd morning, the clouds broke. The sky split blue like a miracle. The water receded enough for Clara to open the door flap wide. They emerged one by one, squinting like cave dwellers, stepping into a world changed again. What had been cabins were now shattered bones of timber. Wagons had floated into the trees and cracked. The saloon was gone. The trading post had collapsed. Only 6 buildings remained upright, and all of them were domes. The rest had drowned, and in their place mud, ruined foundations, and silence. But no bodies, because Clara had taken them all in, every single one who came to her. A week later, a rider came from the east, governor's office, long coat, trimmed beard, notebook in hand. He called her Mrs. Goss and asked permission to write down her story. Clara stared at him. "You gonna pay me for it?" He blinked. "We're offering a certificate of merit, possibly a state citation, and—" "I don't need paper," she said. "I need grain, nails, saplings." The man coughed. "We can arrange supplies." "Then arrange them. Don't tell a story." He paused, then nodded, pencil tapping the edge of his notebook. He tried again. "Would you call what you built a success?" She raised an eyebrow. "You see it, don't you?" He nodded. "And call it what you like. Doesn't change that it worked." He never asked again. That spring, Penance Valley didn't rebuild its cabins. They rebuilt domes, 33 in total, some sunk deeper into the earth, some with chimney vents, some with root cellars dug beneath and waterproofed with clay. They learned from Clara, from what she had done wrong, from what she had done right. She never asked for recognition, but people gave it anyway. Women came to her for advice. Men offered firewood, pelts, meat. Children came with questions. She taught them, and not with sermons, with tools, with tasks, with silence when it was needed, and fury when it was earned. In midsummer, a letter arrived addressed to Clara Goss, matron of the dome. It had no stamp, no sender. Inside was a single line. "You were right. I should have stayed." It wasn't signed, but Clara knew the hand. Josiah toddled by her legs as she read it. He was learning to walk, learning to fall and laugh at the same time. He had his father's nose and her eyes. He carried a piece of winter in his bones, but his laugh was all spring. She folded the letter, placed it in the corner of the dome where the firelight struck it just right, and didn't mention it again. Some things stayed buried. Some griefs didn't need digging up. In the fall, a new family arrived from out east. They looked broken. Skin clung to bone. The father wore boots tied with string. The mother's eyes were hollow. A boy no older than 5 carried a crate of turnips, like it was treasure. They asked if they could camp by the creek. Clara said no. She pointed instead to the ridge. "Build there," she said. "It'll flood in spring otherwise." They blinked at her. Addie stepped forward, now taller, now with a scar across one hand from splitting wood, now calling Clara Ma without hesitation. "She's right," Addie said. "You'll see." They nodded. And within a week, the boy had built his first circle of saplings, and Clara helped him tie the ribs. Years passed. The dome aged. It sagged in places. Josiah grew. Addie took a husband, one of the preacher's sons, quiet and kind. Clara built another dome beside the first, this one with stone at its base. This one meant to last. She never left Penance Valley, not for the city, not for awards, not for what others called progress. She stayed because it had been the dome that saved her, but it was the people inside it that made it home. And when she died, many years later, old and grey and still fierce, the town didn't bury her in a churchyard. They buried her beneath her first dome, which they had preserved, not as a museum, not as a relic, but as a lesson, a place schoolchildren visited, a place mothers whispered about during long winters, a place where one woman, once mocked by every man in the valley, had built something that didn't just endure. It changed the shape of survival, not straight, not proud, not square, but curved, like ribs, like wombs, like domes, like hope,